Hello, Dan Alasso here again, and now it is week 4 or chapter 4 of U.S. History 1. And this week we're going to begin to zoom in a little bit more even to North America and really to the English in North America. And we're going to talk about the way the English kind of consolidated in North America and some of the things that drove them to do that. And actually, ironically, the first thing that drove them to do that a little bit was the French. And so we will begin with New France. And so, as I mentioned previously, the French presence in North America begins really with Jacques Cartier and then with Samuel de Champlain, who visited the Caribbean in 1601 and then the coast of New England in 1603 before he traveled farther north and founded Quebec in 1608. Champlain made a number of Atlantic crossings and he worked diligently, kind of tirelessly, to promote New France. The northern colony grew only slowly, though, because the growing season was very short and there were really better prospects elsewhere in the French colonial world, such as in the Caribbean. And we should remember that developments in one region are often affected by the opportunities available in others, even if those alternative regions don't ultimately end up as a main part of our story. And this will be especially true, actually, in the case of England's Caribbean colonies. But we'll get to that later. The next Frenchman that we want to talk about is Jacques Marquette, who lived from 1637 to 1675. And Marquette was a Jesuit priest who migrated to New France in 1666. And while in seminary in France, he had actually been able to learn several Native American dialects. And so when he was ordained, he was ready to be assigned to Trois-Rivières on the St. Lawrence River to do missionary work among the Indians. After 2 years, he was promoted and he moved to the Great Lakes region. And in 1669, he was assigned to a mission in the Apostle Islands of Lake Superior. He traveled 500 miles to this new posting by canoe. And then 2 years later, he established the St. Ignace mission on Mackinac Island between Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, near the native community and the important fur trading post at Michilimackinac. In 1673, Marquette actually took a leave of absence from his missionary work to join an expedition down the Mississippi with Louis Joliet. They went as far as the Arkansas River because at that time, the southern end of the Mississippi was still controlled by Spain. And then they wintered actually in what would later become Chicago. And by some accounts, they were the first white men to camp in what became Chicago. Marquette actually didn't make it back to his mission. He died in what's now Illinois in 1675 at the young age of 37. The next important Frenchman is René Robert Cavelier, the Sieur de La Salle, who lived from 1643 to 1687. And he sounds like quite an aristocrat. Actually, it was a purchased title that his father had bought after becoming wealthy. But he was also a French explorer and actually also a fur trader who traveled extensively in the Great Lakes and along the Ohio River and the Mississippi. In 1673, while Marquette was on the Mississippi, La Salle was supervising the building of Fort Frontenac at what's now Kingston, Ontario, for the governor of Canada, Frontenac. But of course, he's best known for canoeing all the way from the Illinois River to the mouth of the Mississippi in 1682 and planting a flag and claiming Louisiana for France. La Salle named the colony after his king, Louis XIV. And so the presence of French colonies to their north and south, and the ability of the French to leverage their good relations with their native allies so that they could use the Great Lakes and the Ohio River and the Mississippi River to connect their colonies was a huge challenge to the English. And another huge challenge to the English was Indian resistance. Although the French tried to cultivate good relations and collaboration with their Native American allies, and partially because the population of Canada was growing so slowly, they had an easier time of it. The English colonies in New England were exploding with not only new immigrants, but with a very high birth rate. And as families grew and new farms were established, the English were putting constant pressure on their Indian neighbors. Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, was the sachem of the Wampanoag people, following his father Massasoit and his older brother Wamsutta, who died a little bit mysteriously only a year after their father's death in 1662. So Metacomet, called Philip by the English, became the chief in 1662 and tried to live peacefully with the English. But less than 10 years later, in 1671, the leaders of the Plymouth colony began trying to limit the ammunition that they made available to natives, the shot and gunpowder, and even talked about confiscating their guns. And then, as a last straw, in 1675, the English hanged 3 Wampanoag men for the murder of another Wampanoag. After this blatant insult to the tribe's autonomy, Metacomet went to war. And he recruited his allies, the Narragansett, the Nipmucs, the Podunks, the Nashaway, and the Wabanakis, to try to chase the English out of all of their lands, because they saw that they weren't going to get many more chances. The Pequot and the Mohegan, as well as other Indians from the praying towns, fought on the English side. Metacomet's forces raided farms and attacked villages throughout Massachusetts and Rhode Island, reaching all the way to Maine and westward to Deerfield, which they burned. About 1,000 English in all were killed in a year of warfare, but between 3,000 and 5,000 Native Americans. And this was a blow, because at the beginning of the war, the English population of New England had been about 65,000, but the Indians had numbered only about 10,000. So by the end of this war, the native population had been cut by as much as half, and Metacomet was dead. And ultimately, this would be the last really threatening Indian war in New England. Another challenge that helped the English consolidate in America was the transition from indentured servitude as the main labor force for English colonies to slavery. But this happened first in the West Indies. On the island of Barbados, which had been colonized by the English in the 1620s, planters first briefly grew tobacco as their main export crop and mostly used indentured servants from England for that. In the 1640s, they converted to the much, much more profitable sugarcane, and they copied the sugar planters on the adjacent Spanish-controlled islands and began to rely much more heavily on enslaved Africans. In 1665, in another war with Spain, England took the much larger island of Jamaica from the Spanish and quickly turned it into a lucrative sugar island as well, using slave labor. While slavery was slower to take hold in the Chesapeake colonies, by the end of the 17th century, both Virginia and Maryland had also adopted slavery as the main form of labor to grow tobacco. Chesapeake colonists had tried to enslave native people when they could prevent them from escaping, but they quickly learned that it was more practical to ship captured Native Americans to the Caribbean in exchange for Africans. The exchange rate was 2 Indians for 1 African, because Native Americans were very likely to die resisting their enslavement. So they weren't seen as a very good investment. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia, beginning in 1619, their treatment really resembled indenture more than it did chattel slavery, which would later legally define Africans as property and not as people. In the early years of the colony, many Africans worked as servants and, like their English indentured counterparts, could actually gain their freedom and could even acquire land of their own. Some Africans who converted to Christianity became free landowners with servants, sometimes white servants. So it really wasn't a racial issue yet. The greatest changes in the status of Africans in the Chesapeake toward permanent slavery based on race happened in the last decades of the 17th century. Part of this shift was encouraged by the immigration of English planters from the Caribbean into the new Carolina colonies. In the Caribbean, and then later in the southern North America colonies, farming wasn't about producing subsistence, enough for your family, and then if there was anything extra, selling it out to the market. It was specifically about raising cash crops such as sugar and tobacco, and then later indigo and rice and cotton, to be sold directly into the Atlantic commercial world. And they were so committed to this in places like Barbados that they stopped entirely growing any feed for their animals or any food for the people. And instead, they devoted every acre of land on Barbados to growing sugarcane. And this is completely valid in economic theory. This is the idea of comparative advantage. But they implemented it in an extreme way. And free people were not willing to do this type of work. They were not willing to work in the brutal conditions of Barbados sugar plantations, or even Virginia tobacco operations. And the planters discovered that, as the Spanish and Portuguese had shown in their own plantations in Brazil and in the Caribbean, nothing really was cheaper or more profitable than slaves who could be worked to death and then cheaply replaced. So after 1600, the shipment of Africans across the Atlantic accelerated. The English king, Charles II, chartered the Royal Africa Company in 1672, creating a monopoly over the transport of African slaves to the English colonies. Over the next 4 decades, the company transported around 350,000 captive Africans from their homelands. By 1700, the tiny English sugar island Barbados had a population of 50,000 slaves, which dwarfed the small population of white plantation owners. And to make that work, the English wrote chattel slavery into colonial law. Now, English colonists had not come from a society that included slavery, and they had initially preferred to use indentured servant labor, since there were a lot of poor English people. And although Africans had long practiced slavery in Africa among their own people, it had, of course, not been based on race. Africans enslaved other Africans as war captives or for crimes or to settle debts. And generally, they used slaves for domestic labor and for small-scale agricultural work, not for growing cash crops on large plantations. And they never worked people to death. And African slavery was often a temporary condition rather than a lifelong sentence. And unlike New World slavery, it wasn't inherited from parents to children. And African societies usually incorporated the enslaved people into the families that they worked for. And by the end of a generation or two, the children or grandchildren of enslaved workers were often full-fledged family members or clan members or members of the tribe. But the growing slave trade with Europeans from the 15th to the 16th and 17th centuries had a huge effect and impact on the people of West Africa, because it brought prominence and wealth and power to local chiefs and to merchants who traded slaves for European money and textiles and guns and tobacco and alcohol. Many African rulers also profited by charging Europeans for the right to trade in slaves, and often imposed taxes on slave purchases. Powerful African kingdoms even staged large-scale raids on each other or on their weaker neighbors to meet the demand for slaves. Once sold to the traders, nearly all the captives would be sent on what was called the Middle Passage, a transatlantic crossing that typically took 2 months. By 1625, more than 325,000 Africans had been shipped to the New World, though many thousands, possibly a quarter to a third of all the people, died of illness or despair during the voyage. 4 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Caribbean between 1501 and 1830. And when they reached their destinations in the Americas, Africans found themselves trapped in shockingly brutal slave societies. In Portuguese Brazil, or in the Spanish, French, and English Caribbean, they were typically worked to death in about 3 years on sugar plantations. In the Chesapeake colonies, they faced a longer lifetime of harvesting and processing tobacco. Everywhere, Africans resisted slavery, and running away was common. In Jamaica and other colonies, runaway slaves created what were called maroon communities in remote regions. And these were groups that resisted being recaptured and eked out a living from the land. Many joined natives who had also fled European control in previous generations, and some formed communities that have lasted into the modern era. But initially, one of the big challenges of slavery in the American South was the common cause that slaves would make with poor whites. And a shocking demonstration of this was Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was another English aristocrat who had moved to Virginia in 1674 with a gift of 1,800 pounds from his father to start a life there. 1,800 pounds in 1674 money is a lot. Bacon was able to buy an 820-acre farm with probably a lot of money left over, and he expected to be welcomed into Virginia society, since he was actually related to many of the leading people, including both Governor Berkeley and his wife separately. At first, Berkeley did befriend Bacon and invite him to join the governor's council, but over time, their personalities and possibly commercial rivalry, because they were both trading extensively with the Indians, and also the alarm caused by King Philip's War in New England in 1675, led to disputes over Indian policy on the edge of the English settlement. This bloomed into an open rebellion when Bacon rallied other frustrated men who had grievances against the government. Not only did the English have no prior experience with chattel slavery, but initially the conditions that were faced by slaves and indentured people were very similar. So indentured English people and enslaved Africans often lived side by side, ate and drank together, and often slept together. And this sometimes continued when poor English people completed their indentures. Although, as I've mentioned before, only 1 in 6 indentured people survived to complete their indenture and become a free man. When they did, they often retained their connections to the people who had been their friends. So Bacon's rebellion turned out to be an uprising of both whites and blacks. And it was nearly successful, overthrowing the colonial government. The fright of these lower orders working together to resist the Jamestown elites convinced the authorities of the urgency of separating white servants from black slaves. The rebels had claimed that the Virginia government was impeding their access to land and to wealth that they believed had been promised to them as part of their indenture, and was doing very little to clear the frontier of Indians so that they could expand and own land. The rebel leader, Nathaniel Bacon, was not a poor man, but he also wanted more land on the Virginia frontier for himself. And the governor, fearing more war with the neighboring Indian tribes, had forbidden further expansion. Bacon marshaled these poor people and these former indentured servants who believed that the governor was denying them the right to own their own tobacco farms that they had been promised after their years of service. And Bacon's followers also believed that Berkeley's conciliatory frontier policy left English settlers at risk. The governor had tried to keep peace in Virginia by signing treaties with various local peoples and had done trade deals with the tribes, with Bacon as a competing merchant, ironically. And Bacon and his followers many of whom saw all Indians as an obstacle to their access to land, advocated a policy of extermination. In 1675, war broke out when Susquehannock warriors attacked settlements on Virginia's frontier, killing English planters and destroying plantations, including one owned by Bacon. In 1676, Bacon and other Virginians counterattacked the Susquehannock without the governor's approval. When Governor Berkeley ordered his arrest, Nathaniel Bacon led his followers to Jamestown, forced the governor to flee to the safety of Virginia's eastern shore. Remember, Jamestown was 40 miles up the James River, and then burned the city down. Reports of the rebellion reached England, and the king dispatched royal troops and English commissioners to restore order in the tobacco colonies. By the end of 1676, Virginians loyal to Governor Berkeley had gained the upper hand, executing several leaders of the rebellion. Bacon escaped the hangman's noose, instead dying of dysentery. Without Bacon, the rebellion fizzled out in 1676, but Virginians remained divided, as people who had supported Bacon continued to harbor grievances over access to Indian land. And the victory wasn't a big win for Governor Berkeley either. He was recalled to England to explain what had happened, and he died about a year later. Bacon's rebellion helped to accelerate permanent racial slavery in the Chesapeake colonies. As I had said, at the time of the rebellion, indentured servants had made up most of the workers in the region. But wealthy whites worried about the alliances that black and white servants had forged during this rebellion. African and English workers lived in similar conditions and often mingled with each other. So replacing indentured servitude with chattel slavery would diminish the risks caused by this sympathy of shared experience. Planters began reducing their use of white indentured people, who in any case were often dissatisfied troublemakers, and they created a caste of racially defined slaves, whose movements could be very strictly controlled. And racial separation lessened the possibility of ongoing alliances between black and white workers. And it even healed some of the divisions between the wealthy and the poor whites, who could now unite as members of a superior racial group, even if the poor whites gained no practical benefits from this supposed superiority. While colonial laws in the tobacco colonies had already made slavery a legal institution before Bacon's rebellion, new laws passed afterwards severely curtailed black freedom and laid the foundation for chattel slavery. Virginia passed a law in 1680 prohibiting both free blacks and slaves from bearing arms. And it banned blacks from congregating in large numbers. And it established harsh punishments for slaves who assaulted whites or attempted escape. 2 years later, another Virginia law announced that all Africans brought to the colony would be slaves for life. And then finally, Virginia's leaders passed a law describing slavery as a state inherited by children from their mothers, described in Latin as partus sequitur ventrum. And this ensured that any children of enslaved women would also be slaves for life, even if their fathers were white slave owners. The increasing reliance on slaves in the tobacco colonies and the draconian laws instituted to control them not only helped planters meet their labor needs, but also assuaged English fears of further uprisings and helped alleviate class tensions between rich and poor whites. And while this was going on in the South, in the North, society was also becoming more structured to the benefit of an elite minority. In 1674, just before King Philip's War kicked off, another English aristocrat named Edmund Andros was appointed governor of New York. And after about a decade in New York, he gave up that post to be appointed governor of a new Dominion of New England, which combined all of the former colonies whether they had charters or not. Massachusetts Bay had a charter, Plymouth didn't. Rhode Island and Connecticut at first didn't, but then they got charters. All of these, though, were combined into this Dominion of New England, all under the direction of a single royal appointee, Andros. And many people, especially in Massachusetts, objected both to this change and to Edmund Andros himself. Although the new governor didn't immediately institute a lot of new taxes, as would happen 100 years later, he did restrict the authority of the legislative bodies that had grown up in places like Boston and Plymouth and Providence. And he really curtailed New England's traditional town meetings. And then, to add insult to injury, he tried to promote the Church of England in this Puritan region. And landowners also objected when Andros invalidated land grants that they had obtained under the previous colonial charters. And if all that wasn't bad enough, then in a continuing consolidation of power, New York and East and West Jersey were all added to the Dominion in 1688. And so Andros began to face increasing resistance, even by some of the most prominent men in the colonies, such as Cotton Mather in Massachusetts, who actually went to London to appeal to King James II. But this happened in 1688. And now we have to pause a moment to remember another element of English history, because, of course, all of these people in the colonies are still Englishmen. So things that happen in England, like the English Civil War and the reign of Cromwell, are important. And the next big thing that happened in England was the Glorious Revolution. In 1688, James II was deposed by William of Orange and his wife, Mary II, James II's daughter. It was called the Glorious Revolution because, unlike his father, Charles I, who had been beheaded, James II got off easy and was just replaced as the monarch. When they heard the news from home, the colonists in Boston rose up against Edmund Andros and arrested him. Andros returned to England, but as it turned out, his political career was far from over. King William appointed him governor of Virginia in 1691. And so it was Edmund Andros who established the College of William and Mary in 1693. And then when he was recalled from that job in 1698, Andros became lieutenant governor of Guernsey in the Channel Islands under Queen Anne in the early 1700s. And so English aristocrats did pretty well during this period. And a final English aristocrat that we'll mention today came to America in the 1680s as well. William Penn, who lived from 1644 to 1718, was the son of Admiral William Penn, who had commanded the Royal Navy in the Caribbean and had captured Jamaica for England. So his son, William Penn, had a good name, had a fortune, but unfortunately, he was also a Quaker. And so he was persecuted and even imprisoned for a couple of years in England. But in 1681, King Charles II granted a large piece of North America to William Penn, a huge piece, to repay debts owed to his father. The territory was west of the earlier Dutch and Swedish colonies up the Delaware River, and it was actually larger than the current state of Pennsylvania because it included part of Delaware as well. Penn moved there in 1682 and founded Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, on the site of a Lenape village. Europeans are always establishing towns and cities on the site of pre-existing native settlements. But in this case, although Penn had been granted the entire territory as his personal property by the king, he was also careful to negotiate with the Lenape Indians and to get their agreement to his settlement there. So the colony became a haven not only for Quakers, but for other religious minorities, such as French Huguenots, because this was also about the time that King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes. And so Huguenots again began to be persecuted in France. And other religious groups like German Mennonites and Amish and even Jews. And Penn worked really hard to sell his friends on the attractions of this place and to encourage settlement. Because although he was land rich, William Penn was cash poor. He actually fell into bankruptcy. And although they didn't put him in debtor's prison, they did put him under house arrest. And so later in his life, Penn became so frustrated with his debts and the slow growth of the colony and the expenses that he was continuing to incur that he tried to sell the territory back to the crown. But unfortunately, the crown didn't want Pennsylvania back. And so William Penn died land rich but penniless in 1718. But he had created something very interesting in Pennsylvania that would do a lot to influence the further development of the American colonies and then the new republic. And we'll talk about that another time, but that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.